Welcome to the deep dive. So you were curious about home invasion stories, right? What makes them really work or sometimes not work?
Exactly. What elevates them beyond just, a few scares? The good stuff.
Yeah, the stuff that sticks with you. So today we're diving into Intrusion, that Netflix film from 2021.
Oh, right. Freida Pinto, Logan Marshall Green. I remember that one.
That's it. We've got a pretty detailed critical review here. Covers, well, pretty much everything: plot, direction, characters.
Okay.
And our mission basically is to unpack it, see what it tells us about the genre, its strengths, maybe its weaknesses.
Makes sense. Using Intrusion as a sort of case study for home invasion thrillers.
Exactly. Let's get into it.
Absolutely. And, home invasion films, they really tap into something deep, don't they?
Mm-hmm. Primal.
Yeah, that idea of your safe space, your home being violated, it's unsettling.
Definitely.
You think of classics like Panning Room with that intense spatial tension.
Right.
Or even something more raw like Hush.
Yeah, great example.
And Intrusion sets itself up in that space.
Yeah.
You've got Mira and Henry moving into this super modern, very remote house. She's recovering from an illness.
A fresh start, supposedly.
Supposedly. But the whole setup screams isolation, maybe vulnerability. It promises that mix of mystery, suspense, domestic unease.
Right. This house Henry designed, it's meant to be their sanctuary.
Mm-hmm.
But the review we're looking at, it says that sense of security just gets shattered pretty quick with a break-in.
Of course.
And that starts pulling back layers, revealing secrets. It's a familiar starting point,
Very familiar. The perfect facade crumbling.
Yeah, the outside threat revealing the inside problems. The review even mentions echoes of other films, like Gone Girl, perhaps, hinting at marital issues. Or
Right.
the invitation for that creeping dread, maybe even the starkness of funny games.
Big shoes to fill there.
Right. But here's the kicker. The review immediately flags, predictability.
And that's often the Achilles heel, isn't it?
Right.
Especially for a thriller. You need that suspense, that uncertainty. What does the review say specifically?
It uses the term mechanically predictable.
Oof, that doesn't sound good.
No. It suggests the plot telegraphs its punches way too early.
Right, so you see things coming.
Exactly. It mentions overt foreshadowing and telegraphed revelations.
Which just kills the tension, right? If you're waiting for a twist you already suspect, the reveal just falls flat.
Pretty much. The anticipation becomes confirmation, not surprise.
Yeah, deflates the whole thing.
And the review actually points a finger at the screenplay. Chris Sparling wrote it. He did Buried, which was incredibly tense.
Oh, wow. Yeah, Buried was masterful with its limited setting.
Right. But here, the critique is that the script feels undercooked.
How so?
It says it's quite linear, relies a lot on exposition. It sort of hints at depth, but doesn't really dig in.
So instead of letting the viewer piece things together, it spells it out.
Seems like it. Which means, instead of being gripped, the review suggests you're often just waiting for the next predictable beat.
That makes sense. It kind of breaks the immersion. What are some of those predictable tropes you often see in this genre?
Good question. Well, maybe the conveniently discovered clue, just when things slow down.
Yeah, the diary entry, the hidden file.
Exactly. Or maybe the character who acts suspiciously early on and, surprise, they're involved.
Right. Or like you mentioned, that heavy-handed music cue telling you, this is a scary moment.
Yeah. Takes you right out of it. Feels like the filmmakers don't trust the story or the audience.
Precisely. Lack of subtlety, maybe.
Okay, so let's talk characters. Freida Pinto as Mira. The review says she's credible, portraying the fear, the suspicion.
Which is crucial. You need to believe her fear.
Definitely. But it also says the script really limits her potential journey from being passive because of her recovery to actively fighting back or investigating. It doesn't quite happen.
So she stays more reactive than proactive.
Yeah, described as more of a passive observer in her own unfolding nightmare. How important is that character arc, that transformation for you in these films?
Oh, I think it's huge.
Yeah.
Watching someone find their strength, push back, figure things out, that's what pulls you in emotionally.
Right. You root for them.
Exactly. If the protagonist just sort of lets things happen to them, it's harder to stay invested, I find. You want to see agency.
Makes sense.
Right.
And then there's Henry, Logan Marshall Green. The review calls his performance stoic, even robotic.
Okay. Which could be a deliberate choice,
Yeah.
to make him seem suspicious, maybe hiding something.
Could be. But the review suggests it creates this emotional distance. Like there's not much chemistry felt between him and Mira.
And that could be a problem.
How so?
Well, if it's a psychological thriller, partly about marriage and secrets, you need to feel the baseline relationship first. You need to feel what's potentially at stake between them.
I see. If you don't buy the connection.
Then the potential betrayal or the danger doesn't hit as hard. The secrets need fertile ground, you know?
Yeah.
If they seem disconnected from the start, it kind of lessens the impact of later revelations about their relationship.
That's a really good point. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. How the film looks, the direction Adam Salke directed.
Right.
The review mentions an effort towards like visual sophistication. The house, for instance.
A modernist one.
Yeah, very sleek, geometric. The review suggests it might mirror the emotional coldness or distance between the couple. Lots of negative space, drone shots, tight framing.
Trying to create that feeling of isolation or being watched.
Exactly. Sounds visually deliberate. Setting as mood.
It's a common technique using the environment.
Well,
But how well does it land, according to the review?
here's the critique. It says sometimes these choices feel a bit imposed,
Imposed, meaning?
like not flowing organically from the story. It mentions forced whip pans and abrupt zooms.
Trying too hard to inject panic or unease with camera tricks.
That seems to be the implication. Like the style is trying to compensate for maybe a lack of suspense in the actual scene. Have you seen films like that where the camera work feels desperate?
Oh, definitely. Where it's practically screaming, feel tense now, instead of letting the situation or the performances create the tension. It can feel artificial.
Yeah, exactly that. And the color palette gets mentioned too. Lots of grays, whites, steely blues.
Very cool. Potentially sterile.
Right. Which fits the house and maybe the emotional themes, but the review wonders if it also just distances the viewer too much. Makes it hard to connect emotionally.
So the aesthetic, while maybe thematically relevant, might actually hinder engagement rather than enhance it.
It's a
Interesting.
fine line, isn't it?
It really is. And this carries over into sound, too, it seems.
Yeah, the score by Alex Heffs is called Serviceable.
Serviceable. The faintest of praise.
Pretty much, like it does its job, tries to ramp up tension with music cues.
But maybe isn't memorable or particularly effective, or again, maybe overcompensating.
That seems to be the sense. However, there is a positive note on the sound design.
Ooh.
Specifically during the actual home invasion parts. The review highlights those little sound creaks, clicks, rustles.
The sounds that really get under your skin in that situation, that sense of immediate close threat.
Exactly. So it sounds like the potential for that real atmospheric dread was there in moments.
Just maybe not sustained throughout the whole film.
Seems that way. Which leads us nicely into the themes.
Right. What's bubbling underneath the surface plot?
The review points out the obvious ones. Control, secrets, the illusion of safety.
Standard thriller fare, but potent if done well.
For sure. And also, recovery from trauma. Mira's illness is part of her backstory and trust in relationships.
Okay, that's interesting. Her past trauma intersecting with the present trauma of the invasion. Lots of potential there.
Huge potential. But, and it's a recurring but, it seems, the review suggests these themes aren't really explored deeply.
So they're raised but not developed.
Kind of, like the plot twists feel more like checking boxes for the genre rather than, growing naturally out of these deeper issues.
Obligatory rather than earned twists.
That's a good way to put it. The whole perfect home hiding dark secrets thing is there.
A classic trope.
But the film apparently just skims that surface, doesn't really dig into the why or the complex psychology behind it.
So it sets up a potentially rich thematic territory, but doesn't fully explore it. That's a shame.
Yeah, and this seems to tie into the pacing issues mentioned.
Okay, what did the review say about pacing?
It calls the middle section sluggish. Lots of repetitive scenes, apparently, of Mira just investigating around the house.
The momentum stalls after the initial incident.
That's the feeling, like it struggles to maintain suspense or deepen the mystery effectively. Have you ever felt that in a thriller? Great setup, then it just spins its wheels.
Oh, absolutely. The second act is crucial. If you don't escalate the stakes, deepen the characters, or complicate the mystery in intriguing ways, the audience can check out.
Right, the review literally says the film overstays its welcome.
Ouch. Suggests there wasn't enough substance, character, or theme to justify the runtime once the initial shock wears off.
Exactly. And even the editing, while called competent, is described as lacking urgency. Scenes playing out longer than they need to.
Contributing to that sluggish feel, yeah. It all paints a picture of a film that maybe didn't quite have enough story or depth for its length.
Seems fair, based on this review. So, okay, how does Intrusion fare when compared to the heavy hitters in the genre?
Good question. Context is everything.
The review brings up Panic Room. Again, it's tight control of space, the character's stakes.
Fincher's precision.
And Hush for its clever sensory approach, using the protagonist's deafness.
Yeah, really innovative.
And even The Strangers for its commitment to just pure nihilistic terror.
Which is deeply unsettling in a different way. So where does Intrusion fit in relation to those?
The review positions it as a potentially watered-down version.
Okay. Lacking a strong identity.
Sort of, like it borrows bits and pieces but doesn't commit to a specific tone or innovate much. The suggestion is it might be aiming for a broader audience.
Trying to be a thriller late, maybe? Straddling genres?
Yeah, like part psychological drama, part thriller, but not fully delivering on either promise.
That can be a tricky balancing act. Often satisfies neither camp fully.
And the rating gets mentioned too. PG-13 or 12, depending on where you are.
Which might inherently limit how far it can go with the horror, the violence, or the really intense psychological stuff.
That's the argument, that the rating itself might have held it back from being truly impactful or memorable in the way some R-rated entries in the genre are.
Makes sense. Sometimes those constraints force filmmakers to be more suggestive, which can be effective, but sometimes they just feel limiting.
So, wrapping it all up, the final verdict from the review seems to be, it looks good, but it's hollow.
A film of surfaces, is that the idea? Strong production design, polished look.
Exactly. All that visual effort we talked about. But the core, the story, the characters, the suspense it's lacking, generic is the word used.
Which is pretty damning for a thriller. Generic is the opposite of thrilling.
Right. It suggests that if you're not super familiar with the genre, you might find it, passable. An okay watch.
But for seasoned thriller fans,
they'll likely spot the tropes, predict the twists, and maybe check out mentally quite early.
yeah, you start seeing the seams, the mechanics, instead of just experiencing the story.
The main takeaway seems to be summed up in the review's point that the film just doesn't intrude deep enough.
Doesn't get under your skin, doesn't leave a mark.
Precisely. So bringing our own deep dive here to a close, it sounds like Intrusion had a decent premise, looked polished.
All the ingredients seem to be there.
But ultimately, the predictable plot, the underdeveloped characters, the pacing problems, they stopped it from being really effective, especially within the genre that has seen some real high points.
Right. It serves as a good example, maybe, of how not just hitting the expected beats isn't enough. You need something more innovation, depth, genuine suspense.
Hopefully breaking this down, looking at where the specific film apparently fell short, gives you a better lens for watching other thrillers.
Yeah, understanding what makes the great ones work often comes from seeing where others miss the mark. You start recognizing the craft involved, or the lack thereof.
You can spot those narrative signposts, evaluate if the themes are really being explored, if the characters feel real.
Exactly. Become a more discerning viewer of the genre.
Okay, so final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. We've talked a lot about the violated sanctuary, the home invasion idea. What specific elements within that trope do you find genuinely unsettling or compelling?
What really gets to you personally?
And maybe think about how a filmmaker could twist those expectations, play with them in a way that feels fresh.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Okay, so you sent over some really interesting notes on Intrusion, the 2021 thriller.
Yeah, that's right.
And our plan today is basically to dig into those notes, pull out the most, compelling bits about how this film came together.
Sounds good. There's some great stuff in there, especially starting with the house itself. It wasn't just like a random location they picked, was it?
No, apparently not. This sounds very, very deliberate. What's the background there?
Well, the key thing is how intentional that design was.
Oh.
The super clean lines, the kind of remote, isolated setting. That wasn't just for looks. It was actually meant to mirror the emotional distance between the main characters, that feeling of artificial perfection.
Ah, okay. Like a metaphor almost.
Exactly. Sort of a visual shorthand for the control and maybe even the surveillance happening in their relationship. What feeling did that whole aesthetic give you, that stark modern look?
It definitely felt
Yeah.
cold. Yeah. It added to that feeling that something wasn't quite right,
Yeah.
Even though it looked beautiful on the surface, like a perfect box with something broken inside.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And speaking of what's inside, let's talk about Freida Pinto. We know her from these really powerful dramas. Intrusion felt different for her.
It absolutely was. Looking at her work like Slumdog Millionaire or Trishna, this was her first real dive into the psychological thriller space.
Right.
So it gave her a chance to explore maybe a different kind of emotional range. Less outward drama, more suspense and that sort of vulnerability. Did you pick up on a different side of her performance?
I think so. There was this sort of coiled tension, maybe.
Yeah.
Something specific to the genre, definitely.
Okay.
What about the director, Adam Salke? This was only his second feature film, right?
It was, yeah. His first was I Smile Back. And what's interesting is seeing him move from that really intense, intimate character study into genre filmmaking with Intrusion.
So a bit of a shift.
A shift in genre, yeah. But the sources you sent point out he still kept that focus on themes like, mental instability and tension within the home. He just put it in a thriller package this time.
Okay, so that thread continued. And wow, then there's the fact it was filmed during the pandemic. That must have had a huge impact.
Oh, absolutely. And it's kind of fascinating how those limitations might have actually helped the film in some ways.
How so?
Well, because of all the safety rules, they had a minimal cast, right? They used that isolated location, which was already part of the story, and they probably had fewer scenes, fewer setups.
Right, simpler production.
Exactly.
Right.
But for a thriller, those constraints, the small cast, the isolation, they can actually dial up the feelings of claustrophobia and paranoia that the genre thrives on. It's almost like the real-world situation fed into the movie's mood.
Huh. That's a really interesting point. Like, the circumstances accidentally enhance the genre elements. Okay, lastly, the screenwriter, Chris Barley. He wrote Buried, didn't he?
Yeah.
The Ryan Reynolds movie.
He did, which is known for being incredibly tense, incredibly claustrophobic, just one guy in a box, basically.
Yeah. Intense.
But the source material suggests Intrusion doesn't quite hit that same level of, suffocating tension. And that contrast is interesting, right? It makes you think about how much the setting and the whole approach matter. A big, empty, isolated house gives you a very different kind of scary than being, buried alive.
Yeah, completely different types of unease. Okay, so quite a few layers here.
Mm-hmm.
The house is a symbol, Pinto trying a new genre, the director's evolution, the whole pandemic factor, and the screenwriter's different approach this time around.
Definitely. It really shows how all these different pieces, these choices and circumstances, they all kind of weave together to create the final film you see.
So here's something to chew on for everyone listening.
Yeah.
When you know all this background stuff, the design choices, the production challenges, the actors stretching themselves, does it change how you actually watch the film? Does knowing the how affect the what? Maybe something to think about next time you watch, anything.
Good question to leave people with.
Thanks for joining this deep dive.